for all of that, let's talk through today's top stories with Nick and Sonia Soda. Nick is just coming off the radio, so he'll be with us in just a second. But good morning.
Thank you. I think in a couple of years it's going to be a Baker doing this on the couch with you two.
I know.
I'm going to be out of a job.
100%. I think that's the real fear, isn't it, for many, many
different more than a couple of years away, though.
OK, for you, you've just made me feel a lot better.
You're fine. It's moving quickly, but I think you're safe. Let's start with yesterday afternoon.
Well, I had a lovely afternoon yesterday. So, obviously, I disappeared from here and I went off to Buckingham Palace to go and meet the King. So we were there with the award winners of the Prince's Trust. And this is myself. That's Mottez, who won the award. And that's myself, Stanley Tucci. We presented the award together on the night. And it was just rather lovely. Firstly, to go to the palace and have palace tea and biscuits, which was all rather civilised. But also to see the King. It's the first time I've seen him as the King. And just watching him work that close up, you know, walking around the room, spending loads of time with everybody, really being knowledgeable and knowing so much in-depth information about each and every person he's brought.
And that's the thing, he was really always really well briefed.
Really well briefed and just kind of interested and just, it was lovely. It was lovely. It was just a really lovely afternoon.
And what was he like? Did he sort of have the charisma?
Do you know, you're the second person to ask this. What, has he suddenly got a kingly persona?
Yes, exactly.
I mean, obviously, he's the King and he's royal and you always sort of, you know, you have that thing, but he hasn't changed in any way. He still wants to have a bit of a giggle and, you know, very personable, you know, in that way. But, of course, you know he's now the King. So I think everyone else around him changes slightly. You could see within the room, everybody was like, oh, my God, the King's coming, the King's coming, the King's coming. Yeah. So, but, yeah, it was really lovely. It was a lovely,
they're great pictures and a terrific event and, of course, an amazing charity as well.
Yeah.
So well done you. Right.
Shall we then? Shall we move on to Harry and Meghan, who once again seem to be the talk of everything? A spokesperson for the Duke and Duchess of Sussex yesterday claimed that Prince Harry and Meghan and their mother Dora were involved in a near-catastrophic car chase involving paparazzi on Tuesday night. So this allegedly happened after the couple had attended these awards where we saw these lovely pictures of them together. The statement said that they were in relentless pursuit which lasted more than 2 hours and resulted in multiple near collisions. The problem is here there seems to be a different side of this story coming from the New York Police Department. Yes,
and so the story's moved very quickly to who's absolutely right about this, whose version of events is right. Were Meghan and Harry, was their spokesperson kind of exaggerating when they said it was 2 hours and there were near collisions? But I think that takes us away, I suppose, from the main, what I think we should be thinking about in relation to this story, which is, given what happened to Princess Diana, to Harry's mother, the way in which she died, actually, I think Harry has spoken very movingly about that in his book and in interviews about the long-lasting impact that's had on him and his brother's life, as you would expect. For him still to be caught up in paparazzi chases, and I don't think there's any question that there was that going on. Obviously, the ins and outs of it, how long did it last, how serious was it? I can't imagine how that might feel. So I think we have to be quite careful about criticising them for exaggerating, because, you know, when you know your mother died like that and it's had this long-lasting impact, I just can't imagine what it must feel like to be in a car with your wife and I think her mother and the trauma that must bring up.
So
it must
triggering.
Be awful.
So triggering. And if you read his book, you can see, because virtually every chapter there is mention of...
a reference to it.
Great depth about that. The New York Police Department have said, whilst there were numerous photographers that made their transport challenging, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex arrived at their destination. There were no reported collisions, summonses, injuries or arrests, which I think they said. And you said they've got to be careful about them exaggerating. This is when it gets spiralled and spiralled. It becomes something else. It grows new legs, and suddenly they were going at 80 miles an hour, which I think most people who heard that thought, how do you do that in New York? But nevertheless, Nick, thank you for joining us. He's off the radio now. As Sonia was saying there, on a personal level, for this to happen, given the history, that's got to be triggering.
Oh, of course it has. I'm reminded of the words of the late, great Queen Elizabeth II when she said, recollections may vary, and I think we might have that here. You're absolutely right, and we've looked at this quite closely this morning. I know New York, as we all do. I actually lived and worked in New York. There's no way you're going to be able to do 80 miles, and we're talking about the centre of Manhattan going up Upper East Side.
Did they
There's
say
no way you're
80
going to be...
miles an hour? Did
they
say that? I don't think they said that.
created.
I think that's a... Did they?
No, there wasn't. Even the mayor referred to, quotes, the high-speed police chase, the mayor of the city of New York. The suggestions were that sometimes they were caught in traffic, at times they were reversing down a one-way street, and at other times even they were reaching 80 miles an hour. So, as I say, recollections may vary.
Right.
The key here is that someone who is so important... Bear in mind, we have a young man who I would say wrongly started talking about his very brave service in Afghanistan. That means potentially he is a target. We must be aware of that, and he's a man who needs protection. How we have allowed a situation where someone so important in the world perspective has a security team that they think it's a good idea at one point to get him and his wife out, to take them to a police precinct or a police station, where the police's action is then to call a taxi to try and get them away. That taxi then comes back, so they call a second taxi. We are talking about one of the most identifiable couples in the whole of the world, a man who has security risks, and frankly, it's not good enough. Whether it's the NYPD, the New York Police Department, whether it's their own security team, whether we revisit the issue of the Metropolitan Police in London offering protection, they deserve and they need better. Fortunately, nothing came badly of this, but it is not good enough to be depositing them at police stations and putting them in effectively Uber taxis to get them home.
Yeah.
The cab driver actually said he drove them for about 10 minutes on Tuesday night, said the couple were clearly nervous during that particular part of the short journey.
It's awful for the cab driver too, because cab drivers, I mean, often they will be taking people who might be well known to the public, but somebody who's being chased by paparazzi, like that doesn't come with your training as a black cab driver or an Uber driver.
No. This is a worrying story. Vaping among age 11 to 17-year-olds in Britain has increased from 7.7% last year to 11.6%. That's a 50% increase, it's saying here. This is according to a survey of young people from the charity Action on Smoking and Health. So this is a suggestion that actually vape, because of all the different flavours and the colours, is kind of, you walk into a corner shop and it's like this rainbow of vapes that are there, that is becoming quite appealing and attractive to young people.
I think it's a massive and growing issue, actually. We're doing really well with smoking in young people, so rates are down, but vaping is up. And it's exactly as you say, Holly, it's incredibly lightly regulated in the UK, vaping, if you look at a country like Australia, where it's much more tightly regulated, for example. So that means that, you know, even though it's illegal to sell vapes to the under-18s, it's absolutely OK to market to them. I mean, why would you have a bubblegum flavour vape apart from marketing? What adult's going to think, oh, I'll have bubblegum or candy floss a day? It's about marketing to children. The other really worrying thing is it's not just the way it's presented, it's the fact that it's very lightly regulated in terms of the chemicals going into these vapes. So nicotine is a dangerous substance, it's highly addictive, it's linked to health conditions, and it's dangerous for children. They shouldn't be ingesting nicotine. We've got no idea of the levels of nicotine in some of these products. Some of the trials have shown that they have many higher levels, many more times the amount of nicotine than's advertised. Plus, we've got no idea about the other chemicals in it. So I think we need to take... It can help some people give up smoking. That's a good thing. But it's not something should be marketed in this way. And I think we should have much tougher regulation around it in the same way that we do smoking, maybe even plain packaging. But we've got to make sure that children are not being marketed and push this stuff.
Nick, politicians and medics of today demanded the government urgently cracks down on this ever-growing crisis laid bare by Action on Smoking and Health's annual poll.
It's absolutely right, Sonia. It is so exploitative, and it puts my head in my... I put my head in my hands sometimes. We have so many government restrictions and forms of regulation, and we try and encourage children that they must eat this or they mustn't eat that or they should be doing this. This is so obviously fixable. The companies are exploiting our children. There's, as you rightly say, Holly, it is a rainbow of colours. Perfect description. It's a rainbow of colours when you go in there. They are clearly marketed. If I'm not a smoker, thank the Lord, but if I'm trying to give up 20, 30 a day, I'm not going to be drawn to bubblegum flavour. This could be solved so quickly, and we owe it to our children for there to be legislation discussed immediately, brought forward, and to get the manufacturers to back down. Plain packaging, by the way, Sonia, is probably a very good idea. I hadn't thought of that. That's a tremendous idea.
So that's one thing. How would you crack down on this? I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think it was the BBC that ran a test. They sent a young schoolgirl into shops to try and buy vapes, and a very high proportion of them didn't challenge and just sold them on. And so you can buy them. They're clearly kids are very clever. They'll know where to go and get them and then pass them on in school. How do you stop this from happening?
I mean, I would... Sorry.
No, go ahead, Sonia. Go ahead, Sonia.
What I would probably do is regulate it almost in the same way that you do cigarettes. So recognising the fact that for some people they can be a useful way to give up smoking, but to make them harder to buy, so you keep them under the counter, like with cigarettes in a drawer or, like, you know, behind a closed cabinet, plain packaging. So it's not kind of immediately there and sort of shouting, you know, jumping out at children. And I would also possibly sort of say, well, actually, maybe you need, you know, maybe it's part of a stop smoking programme that people get them, for example, but they're just not sold and advertised to children.
Nick?
Yeah, you go to the source, Philip. This is relatively straightforward. Quite rightly, all local authorities have trading standards officers. They're very skilled men and women who are making sure that we don't have dangerous goods come into our homes or wherever it might be, our workplaces. You actually operate some stings, as you just referenced a television show. And once, if I'm in that business, if I'm running a newsagent or whatever it might be in one part of town, and I hear that someone the other side of town has been selling these to a 14-year-old, he or she has been done. And I'm serious now, and they've paid a fine of perhaps £5,000 or £10,000. That word will get round that town very, very quickly. People will not start it. And I'm sorry that people are going to suffer £10,000 fines. I realise that's a lot of their takings gone. But we are talking with children's health, and these operations could be put into place relatively quickly.
We've got another health story here now. Obese patients cost the NHS twice as much as those of a healthy weight. This is landmark research has found that the average of £1,375 a year is spent on each of the heaviest patients.
Yeah, and this is because obesity is associated with so many other long-term health conditions, you know, higher risk of cancer, higher risk of heart disease. I think when you look at the evidence, actually, it's one of the biggest sort of killers of people before their time, alongside something like smoking. So I think it's just a reminder to us all that actually obesity it's not just, you know, a personal choice, and it's not just about lack of willpower, actually. Some people, their obesity is linked to factors like, you know, genetic factors, you know, the sort of thrill, the dopamine hit they get from eating food. So it's a real public health crisis, and we need to think about healthy eating and sort of mainstreaming that as a society.
Nick, it's a very complex subject. There are many reasons as to why it may happen, but nevertheless, the NHS could save nearly £14 billion a year if everyone was at a healthy weight.
And that is obviously a figure to look at. And the other story that was alongside that, which is what we've been discussing, you might have heard of these, I'm sure you've covered them on your show, these injections, these semaglutide injections that people can take. Well, there's a very live debate now, and they are starting this in the United States, that children who present as obese from age 12, if you put them on these injections, they can lose the equivalent of 3 stone. I'm sorry, I can't remember what that is in kilograms, but 3 stone. So they no longer become obese children, and then you try and encourage them into a life where they take up diet, they take up exercise. That is potentially, because let's face it, people of my age, and I'm carrying far too much weight, there's not a lot you're going to do when you're going to persuade me, because I am what I am. I like a glass of red wine, and that is unlikely to change. But if you look at early teens or even pre-teens, 12-year-olds, if you could use these injections once they're safely researched, if you could use those and turn him or her away from a life of obesity, not just for the benefits to themselves, but the benefits to the NHS, that's a very live debate, and they've got a lot of calls going today.
I think a lot of people would be really quite scared about having their children injected.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's something that's got to be properly researched, but I think the evidence that's coming out about it is quite promising. And the issue is, I mean, we've got really high levels of childhood obesity in this country. And the issue is, if you're obese as a child, you know, those health risks stay with you for the rest of your life, and it can end up, you know, in your 50s and 60s having massive health consequences for you. So I totally take that point. And, you know, I think I can understand why people would feel squeamish as well about a drug to sort of try and cut appetite down and help people lose weight that way. But I think when you look at the long-term costs, this is quite an interesting... But I also think we've got to target the food industry more. So, you know, the UK actually was one of the first countries to reduce our salt intake as a population, because basically the government clamped down on companies and said, you must reduce salt in your foods. It's doable. But that was a Labour government. This government has been more hands-off with the food companies. And the problem is when you've got companies loading ready meals with, like, fat and salt and biscuits and stuff like that, it becomes like an arms race. So everyone has to do it to achieve the same levels of taste. And if you force companies, it sounds authoritarian, but we don't have a lot of choice because all biscuits are like that. If you force companies to bring those levels down, it does work.
Just a very quick last word on this one topic, Nick. We'll come back after the break in a second.
I think the idea of manufacturers being targeted is a good one. But, Phillip, just to clarify, you're right. You wouldn't want a 12-year-old to be injecting him or herself for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. It's a targeted course just for the first 2 or 3 years, possibly maximum, to get the situation under a degree of control.
All right. Thank you. Stay put for now, please.